Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Assalamu alaikum, with greetings of peace to all of you. On behalf of the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, I welcome you all to today's program. Today's debate is the first of the quarterly debates on the general topic of belief and unbelief in a post-secular era. These debates and discussions aim to broaden and deepen our understanding of religion and religious beliefs, and introduce various Muslim and non-Muslim intellectuals and academicians who work on these issues to the public. We are very excited to have two great academicians, Dr. Sheamur and Dr. Ali Paya, for today's debate, and have Dr. Yaser Mirdamadi as the moderator. I thank all those who work hard to bring this debate in fruition. Also, we welcome your input and suggestions on future debate topics and other matters. Please use the Zoom chat feature to send us your comments or email us anytime at info@iccnc.org. Again, I apologize for any inconvenience that caused you because of the start time confusion between Pacific Standard Time in the United States and also the UK summertime and GMT time. So it's a learning. This is our first program, so we are learning. Now I turn over the program to the event's moderator, Dr. Mirdamadi. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get started, shall we? In the name of God, my name is Yaser Mirdamadi, and it's my honor to moderate this debate tonight. As Mr. Sheikh al-Islami explained, this debate is the first session of the first debate cycle held by the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, ICCNC. The main theme of the 2022 debate cycle is belief and unbelief in a post-secular era. This session's topic, which is put in a question form, is it better for a critical rationalist to be non-religious? To which Professor Shermer answers no, meaning it is better for a critical rationalist to be non-religious, while Professor Ali Paya answers yes, meaning it is not better for a critical rationalist to be non-religious. What critical rationalism as a technical term means and how it is different from other conceptions of rationality will be explained as agreed between the debaters by Professor Shermer in his opening statement. I'll introduce guest speakers shortly, but let me briefly explain the debate format. The debaters present their separate opening remarks one at a time. Remarks should take no more than 20 minutes for each side. Then each debater has 10 minutes to respond to the other side directly. Debaters cannot speak or interfere during the other side's opening remark or rejoinder. Following opening remarks and rejoinders, we will have intra-panel discussion. Rejoinder each side will be 10 minutes. The debaters engage with one another directly during the intra-panel discussion. The discussion in the intra-panel part is guided by arguments from opening statements and rejoinders. Only in the intra-panel discussion part can each debater speak and interfere during the other side's talk and even interrupt each other. But the flow of the debate should be observed. The moderator may interfere if it feels like the debate is being hijacked by one side. Otherwise, he or she will remain silent. The intra-panel discussion will last 20 minutes. And finally, the debaters deliver separate 5 minutes closing arguments. This is the final opportunity to reiterate their points, sell their arguments, and persuade the audience. The debaters agreed that Professor Shermer would begin the debate. Now let me introduce him. Jeremy Shermer was educated at the Friends School, Saffron Walden, Essex, and then at the London School of Economics. He also worked for 8 years as a full-time assistant to Professor Sir Karl Popper. He taught philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, political theory at the University of Manchester, and was Director of Studies at the Center for Policy Studies in London. He was then a Research Associate Professor at the Institute for Human Studies at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. He subsequently taught political theory and then philosophy at the Australian National University. Professor Shermer has published books about Friedrich Hayek entitled Hayek and After, and Karl Popper entitled The Political Thought of Karl Popper. He also edited Popper's book called After the Open Society, and Hayek's book called Law, Legislation, and Liberty in Hayek's collected works. Professor Shermer was also editor or joint editor of 3 other books and has published about 100 papers in journals and book chapters in philosophy, political theory, the history of economic thought, and the sociology of religion. He has now retired as an emeritus fellow of the Australian National University to Dumfries in Scotland. I've been to Edinburgh, but never to Dumfries, maybe another time, where he's currently at work on a number of academic projects. These include delivering lectures on Karl Popper and critical rationalism. Critical rationalism using Zoom. He has convened 3 Zoom-based international conferences on Popper's work. He will shortly be delivering a series of lectures on modern Western political thought via the internet to students in a university in China. He also regularly contributes pieces on a variety of topics in politics, philosophy, religious studies, and political economy, which are published in Croatian in the online journal called Idaya, if I pronounce it correctly. Now let us see how Professor Shermer provides a negative answer to the question, is it better for critical rationalists to be non-religious? Professor Shermer, the virtual floor is yours for 20 minutes, please.
Thank you so much to all of you for inviting me to take part. Let me start by explaining what I'll be arguing. In my view, a critical rationalist, an approach which Professor Paya and I share and which I'll shortly explain, can be perfectly reasonably religious. Professor Paya himself is himself a critical rationalist, and he's religious, and he's a perfectly reasonable man. But I'm going to argue that it is more reasonable to be non-religious. Why? Essentially because the intellectual problems facing people in the Abrahamic tradition who are religious seem to me daunting. And I will suggest that it's not reasonable to think that they can be overcome. Critical rationalism is a view which sees us as aiming at truth, but sees all our views as fallible. It downplays the role of personal feelings of certainty. They may matter to us individually, but they don't tell us what's true. Rather, we need to learn from others, from their criticisms and from tests, which both we and they agree are telling ways of evaluating our views. While getting impressive empirical confirmations of our ideas may encourage us, as we learn from the history of science, this doesn't mean that we can be sure that we've reached the truth. Critical rationalism also suggests that we should evaluate intellectual positions in the light of how they fare in debate over time. Clearly, if a particular view hasn't done too well, in a sense which I'll explain, that doesn't mean that aspects of it may not in fact be correct, and that someone who favors such a view might not find a way in which they can respond creatively to the problems that have been discovered about their viewpoints so far. But an objective evaluation of their situation might conclude that the prospects of their doing this, the prospects of them being able to respond creatively to these problems are pretty daunting. And that it is in this sense that a proponent taking up this heroic task might be judged unreasonable. One might perhaps suggest that there's a parallel here to my saying that for my 75th birthday, I wish to climb Mount Everest. There are obvious problems about this. I am not a mountaineer. I am fat. I'm unfit, and I could continue. It's not impossible that I could climb Mount Everest, but it seems unreasonable to think that I would be successful. To climb it on my 75th birthday isn't a reasonable aim. As I've indicated, a critical rationalist approach, in my view, involves an attempt to sum up and to get agreement about what the character of the debate about issues has amounted to up to the present point. This isn't something that any one scholar can expect to achieve in any field, let alone someone who, as I do here, attempts to address the Abrahamic tradition as a whole. I'm acutely aware that I'm not a specialist in any of the traditions involved. And as a non-Muslim talking before what may well be a predominantly Muslim audience, I may make terrible mistakes. May I also apologize for any disrespect that I might show in the course of this debate, which is certainly not intended as such. I'm all too aware of my fallibility, but I believe that the path to truth lies through advancing views which we think may be correct and then getting criticism from other people. Above all, the critical rationalist aims at truth. He or she thinks that their attempts to reach it are fallible, and that we depend crucially on learning from critical input from other people. I thus hope that my errors not only may be corrected, but also, if there are terrible mistakes or there's inadvertently disrespect, that I may be forgiven. The best that we can hope for is that our empirical claims can withstand criticism and testing so far, and that our non-empirical claims, metaphysical or religious claims, are opened up to criticism by way of indicating clearly what problems they're attempting to resolve, and that they've also withstood criticism so far. In each case, it's crucial to pay attention to how the debate has gone, so that we don't respond to difficulties by way of unacknowledged intellectual retreat. Outside of mathematics and logic, it seems to me simply a mistake to think that we should be after proofs, and even in these technical areas, what are offered as proofs are fallible. Rather, our aim should be to try to argue that the ideas which we're advancing are cogent, are to be preferred to alternatives, and have so far been able to withstand serious criticism. Now, what about problems? I will speak only about 6 out of many possible issues. Thus, I'll turn to the substance of our debate. I will raise some problems for the theist in the Abrahamic tradition. And once again, I apologize for the fact that a debate format could mean that I am inadvertently behaving in a way that seems disrespectful. My first problem concerns the relationship between God and what is good. We all tend to think that there's more to what is good and bad than just our personal tastes, or what our particular society happens to favor, or behavior which happens to have been to the advantage of our species in its development. But there is, I think, a problem facing all of us as to how the gravity and significance that we wish to give to ethics fits into our understanding of what we know about the world. A theistic view might indeed offer some reassurance that objective values are real, that they are, as it were, part of the fabric of the universe. However, such views typically don't tell us how it is that values fit into the world. That's to say that theism, it seems to me, while affirming the importance of objective values, doesn't help with this problem of what the place is of values in the world as we're discovering it to be, a problem that faces all moral objectivists. And I think the theistic view faces some problems of its own. For example, just what is the relationship between God and what is good? The issue here is, how do you steer a course between making God in some sense subservient to objectively existing values, or making values simply what God has decided, a bit in the way that an arbitrary ruler might decide what the content of the law is? Second, there is the problem of the goodness of God. We take God in the Abrahamic tradition to be all-powerful, to possess complete knowledge, and also to be good. There is a huge literature on how this relates to the problem of human and other suffering. Clearly, if the world is given a particular character and people can act freely within it, this may produce difficult and painful consequences, but not ones the existence of which I think poses particular philosophical problems about evil. What seemed to me more of a problem is what one might say look more like design faults, and ones which over time humans might be able to remedy. Consider here the terrible problems of cancer and of Alzheimer's disease, which we may hope over time to address, as well as many less dramatic problems, and some of which indeed we have been able to resolve. That they can in principle be addressed indicates that things don't have to be like this. But why then, if God is both all-powerful and good, are they there? It seems to me woefully insufficient to say, well, people need something to stimulate them or problems to work on. If issues of this kind and seriousness were within the power of any good parent to address in respect to their children, they would surely do so. Not say, oh, the children might be able to deal with them when they grow up. The problem for the theist here looks to me to be that if God is both good and all-powerful, why did he leave us facing various horrors when they could, on the face of it, have been addressed without setting the fundamental order of things or undermining our autonomy? As, after all, our own limited medical discoveries make clear where we've been able to develop remedies. Now, there may, of course, be some deep reason for all of this, but as far as I can see, if this does exist, God, as is understood in the Abrahamic tradition, has not explained what it is. And this, if I can say so, would seem to me to be another fault. Next, there is the issue of homosexuality. On my understanding, this, on traditional views of the Abrahamic tradition, is condemned in dramatic terms. Some liberal Christians have tried to get round this, but those, it seems to me, with more intellectual integrity, say that people who are sexually attracted to their own sex have no option but to be celibate and to ask for support and fellowship from their co-religionists in trying to cope. The problem, as far as I can see, for the theist is that homosexual orientation seems to be either innate or to be an involuntary product of certain social circumstances. People who are homosexually oriented feel just the same way about some members of their own sex as the rest of us do towards some members of the opposite sex. One is not here dealing, as one might, with something that's a kind of gratuitous indulgence in something perverse, but something that plays a key role in people's orientation to others, and which could be the vehicle for deep love, affection, and the relationships that last over time in the same kind of way as do those between heterosexual couples. The British, now American writer Andrew Sullivan has offered a powerful and basically conservative argument for gay marriage, along the lines that it's better for all involved if homosexuals have the possibility of stable, loving relationships which are socially recognized and reinforced. The problem here with the Abrahamic tradition is that we're offered a picture of an all-knowing God simply condemning people for orientation which, whether genetic or a social product, seem involuntary at the level of the individual and cutting them off from some of the deepest aspects of human life. Next, I'd like to say something brief about mysticism. I think the mystical experience is real in the sense that similar phenomena have been described by many different individuals. However, the problem about those in the Abrahamic faiths invoking this in support of their religious views seems to me to be that what people experience is strongly influenced by the religious traditions in which they're operating. Followers of Mrs. Blavatsky's ideas about theosophy reported experiences of encounters with spiritual masters, whom it turns out that the founder of theosophy actually invented. Although there is a lot reported by those within the Abrahamic traditions, which seems in its character more pantheistic than should make those in those traditions, I think, feel happy. In addition, there are obviously pantheistic reports from the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and also a lot that seems to fit pantheistic ideas from people who are completely secular, but have experimented with certain hallucinogenic drugs. All that I want to say here is that it seems to me that if someone wishes to claim mystical experience in support of their religious views, I think they need to offer us a cogent theory about the character of all this and its relation to reality, rather than just picking experiences that support their own favored views and ignoring the rest. Next, messiahs and the end of the world. I'll only say briefly that it seems to me that all speculation about messiahs and ideas about the imminent end of the world should be treated as an embarrassment and drops. We've had endless such speculations, all of which have been wrong. They've disturbed people and led them to do silly things, and in my view, have distracted them from the important task of developing institutions and ethical codes which make for good behavior in our changing concrete circumstances. Finally, there's the problem of Abrahamic theism and our developing knowledge about the world. If the world is God's product, as the Abrahamic tradition tells us, then on the face of it, our revealed knowledge of this should surely offer us a program for how the world should be understood, a key to how the world actually is. But in the Christian Middle Ages, and on my understanding in Islam, it was basically to classical Greek philosophy, Platonic, Neoplatonic, and Aristotelian, that religious people went for leads, that's to say, rather than to their own religious ideas. While subsequent to the scientific revolution, huge but fallible strides have been making use of ideas which have no obvious link with the Abrahamic tradition at all. If I'm right that these are problems that have to be taken seriously, then scholars attracted to the Abrahamic tradition might try to respond to these issues. The options are open, but two tendencies here seem to me terrible. The first is what I might call the ad hoc reinterpretation of one's tradition in the face of failure, so as to claim that things that were understood literally are in fact just to be understood as poetry or some kind of symbolism. Clearly, there is poetry and symbolism in all the Abrahamic traditions, and material may be open to many different levels of understanding. What it seems to me is problematic is to retreat from what's seen to be empirical, historical, or metaphysical claims, simply in the face of the fact that one's clearly got things wrong. It puts one on a par with a fortune teller who simply dismisses all forecasts which they made which were wrong as not actually having been forecasts at all. The alternative is also to simply seek for parallels between odd aspects of contemporary science and what is to be found in the Quran or the Bible. This is typically done in an arbitrary manner. Alternatively, one might have what in principle is a serious agenda, like that of the proponents of so-called intelligent design, in taking issue with Darwinian approaches in biology. The problem here is that, in my view, these people don't take seriously what they'd actually have to accomplish to produce a genuine alternative to what they're criticizing. All told here, my argument is for intellectual adventure, that the proponents of theism should say something interesting which challenges current secular ideas if they're to expect anyone to take them seriously. Instead, my worry is that we'll get more and more of what is experienced within so-called liberal Christianity, that's to say, steady intellectual retreat from a religious approach which made serious claims to knowledge about the world, about history, about theology and ethics, to a systematic shedding of any interesting claims about anything, a retreat into moral platitudes and into the echoing of the changing secular wisdom of the day, while conservative Christians seem to me typically to fail to engage seriously with the intellectual challenges that have been offered of their views. The key issues facing the religious believer who is interested in intellectual issues look to me to be, first, to say something interesting to an increasingly secular world, to tell us what, in their view, things are like and how these claims are to be assessed. Second, to review the debates that have taken place over history, to see whether they have been in intellectual retreat. And third, to set out in the light of those debates what the problem situation is that they face and how they think it should be addressed. In my view, it is in the face of the sheer challenges of this that while their individual courage may be admirable, I think that their hope that they can meet this challenge isn't a reasonable one. I thus think that there are real problems to be addressed, as indeed there are facing non-theists who, in my view, tend also to duck the problems that they need to grapple with. And on neither side can we expect that there'll be knockdown answers. But, and this is why I take the view that I do about the motion before us, it seems to me that the problems facing the believer are particularly daunting. I can wish a believer who sets out to tackle them all the best, but the task before them looks to me so daunting that I don't think their hope of overcoming it is a reasonable one. Accordingly, while I think that a clever and very able man such as Professor Paya can be both a critical rationalist and a religious believer, I don't think it's reasonable for him to take this view, just because the problems facing him in dealing with such matters look so difficult that it's unreasonable to judge in the current circumstances that they can be overcome. His prospects look to me about on a par with my hopes of successfully climbing Mount Everest on my 75th birthday. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shermer. Almost perfect timing. Okay, now it's time to introduce the second guest speaker. Ali Paya is a professor of philosophy at the Islamic College affiliated with Middlesex University, London, and the chair of the Islamic College Research Ethics Committee. He's also an adjunct professor of philosophy at the National Research Institute for Science Policy, Iran. He completed his undergraduate and graduate studies in electronic engineering, philosophy, and philosophy of science in Sharif University, Tehran University, and University College London. He also studied Islamic philosophy with traditional masters in the field in Iran and I suppose mainly Shahid Mutahari. As a visiting professor, Paya has worked with many international universities and research centers, including the University of Westminster, Middlesex University, the Center for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, all in the United Kingdom, the University of Belgrade, and the Albach Research and Training Center in Austria. Paya has authored more than 28 books in Persian and English and has translated or edited nearly 10 titles in Persian and English. He has published more than 100 research articles in Persian, English, Arabic, and German. His most recent publications include Islam, Modernity, and a New Millennium, Themes from a Critical Rationalist Reading of Islam, 2019. Science, Society, and Development, Essays on the Public Understanding of Science, 2021. Religious Science, Indigenous Science, and Islamic Science, Thinking the Impossible or Thinking Ahead of Time, 2021. Methods, Methodologies, and Perspectives in the Humanities and Social Sciences, with particular reference to Islamic Studies, a Critical Rationalist Interpretation, forthcoming 2022, and the Quran versus the Theory of the Evolution, a critical assessment of the contrasting views of two prominent Shia scholars of 20th century, Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Tabatabai and Dr. Yadullah Sahawi, forthcoming 2023. Now let us see how Professor Paya provides a positive answer to the question, is it better for a critical rationalist to be non-religious? Please.
Thank you so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let me begin by again thanking you, the moderator, Dr. Mirdamadi, and the organizers of this meeting at the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, in particular Dr. Ali Paya and Mr. Sheikh al-Islami. My thanks also to my friend and fellow critical rationalist Professor Shermer for participating in this debate and for his incisive arguments. I am not sure whether I will be able to match his eloquence and depth of arguments. I also like to extend my heartfelt condolences to the people of Abadan on the tragic loss of the loved ones in the collapse of the Metropole Tower, which happened almost 10 days ago. In the first part of my presentation, I would like to share the following thoughts with you. Professor Shermer has presented some serious challenges to believers. Given the extent and depth of his arguments, the 20 minutes assigned for my opening remarks seem woefully short. In particular, one of his main challenges, namely the problem of evil, is an issue which many great thinkers have discussed for more than 2 millennia. Therefore, realistically speaking, in the course of this debate, the best I can hope for is to merely present the outline of some arguments that aim to show why the position of a critical rationalist who is a believer has an edge over the position of his non-believer colleague. I don't know what happened to my... do you still see me? Sorry.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yes. We can see you and hear you, okay. Professor Paya. Yeah.
Professor Sheamur has, for obvious reason, I speak as a Muslim critical rationalist. Here the plan of my talk. First, I will say a few words about the similarities between critical rationalism and religion in general. Secondly, I try to shed some light on the argument from evil, the ontological status of values, and God's justice. Thirdly, I try to briefly explain the position of a religious critical rationalist concerning the issue of non-conventional lifestyles. And finally, if I have time, I will highlight one major conceptual difficulty which is faced by non-believers. I'll discuss some other difficulties for non-believers in the other parts of my debate. Due to time constraints, I postpone my discussions concerning the epistemic status of religious or mystical experiences and the relationship between religion and our knowledge of reality to the second part of this debate. But before beginning the main part of my opening remarks, I would like to suggest to Professor Sheamur not to lose hope with regard to his plan of climbing Mount Everest. In 2013, an 80-year-old Japanese man, Yuichiro Mio, if I pronounced his name correctly, reached the summit for the third time. I guess, therefore, there is plenty of room for being hopeful for my dear friend, Professor Sheamur. Now, the first part of my talk is critical rationalism and religion. Critical rationalism, as a distinct school of thought and a way of life, has many things in common with certain interpretations of religion. Both are against the extremist understanding of religion manifested by the likes of Daesh or supremacist Christians or militant Hindus who kill those who they regard as others. Both are anti-positivism, anti-materialism, anti-physicalism, in that they subscribe to the view that reality is far richer than what can be grasped by the testimony of our senses or empirical evidence. Both believe that there are many mysteries in reality, some of which we may never be able to comprehend or decipher. Both maintain that individuals and communities ought to be moral and uphold and observe codes of morality. Both share the view that knowledge is a pathway towards spiritual emancipation, and truth is the ultimate goal of our knowledge pursuits. Both aim at making the world a better place for all, and both argue that future is open and optimism is a moral duty. In the second part of my talk, I discussed the issue of God and the problem of evil. Professor Sheamur's argument from evil was suggested, as was suggested earlier, present a major challenge to believers. In the time left, without denying the gravity of this problem, I try to unpack some aspects of it. Let's begin by noting that evil is an absence of good. It is a privation. Like shadows, it does not have a real existence. There are two types of evil. First, natural evil, like natural disasters, such as earthquakes, eruption of volcanoes, pandemics, etc., which are regarded as evil only when looked at from a human perspective. For example, a quake or a hurricane in an uninhabited part of the earth, which does not cause the death of human beings and destruction of their properties, is not regarded as evil. Of course, it should not kill animals and other sentient beings as well. Moral evil is the second type of evil, which is caused as a result of humans' immoral acts. A corrupt politician who betrays his constituency or a murderer who kills innocent individuals are just two cases in point. With regard to both types of evil, further deliberation would reveal that in many cases, the appearance of an evil and the suffering that it causes are directly related to the intended or unintended human action. For example, the recent tragedy of the collapse of the Metropole Tower in Abadan was due to the human negligence of the fact that nature takes its course regardless of people's wishful thinking. Similarly, those who build their houses in areas that are low-lying and liable to flooding and neglect the fact that putting in place proper flood control measures is a necessity, suffer from the consequences of their negligence. Or when people choose unhealthy lifestyles, for example, by eating too much processed foods, exposing themselves to excessive amounts of sun rays without proper protection, or inhaling polluted air on a daily basis, etc., they will be liable to suffer from all types of diseases. With respect to moral evil, people suffer as a result of the ill intent of their fellow human beings who have chosen to exercise their free will in morally unacceptable ways. The recent tragic killing of 19 innocent school children and 2 of their teachers in America by a young man who was not mentally ill, and the case of a British sperm donor who fathered 15 children without telling their lesbian mothers who had received his sperm about his inheritable condition are just 2 examples of the appearance of moral. Another aspect of the problem of evil, which we must take into account, is that from a certain perspective, it has 2 dimensions, intellectual and emotional. I submit without reservation that while one may be able to explain to some extent the intricacies of the problem of evil intellectually and show that it has got nothing to do with an all-powerful, all-knowing God whose will is absolute and non-conditional, it is not at all easy and even maybe impossible to tackle the emotional aspect of this problem. A mother whose little child has died as a result of an incurable type of cancer may well remain inconsolable even after listening to many lengthy rational explanations. One of the trickiest aspects of the problem of evil is that people ask where God has been when they were suffering and calling upon him but receiving no reply. While I readily admit that one may not always be offered to be able to offer a satisfactory answer to the above question, I suggest that if one could momentarily bracket the emotional aspect of the problem, it may be possible to take some steps towards a somewhat reasonable answer concerning its intellectual aspect. There is a nice proverb in English which says, "You cannot have your cake and eat it." But what does it mean in the context of this discussion? The difference between us, the human beings, and both animals and angels is that while animals act according to their pre-programmed instincts, and angels act according to their pre-programmed rational designs, it is us, the human beings, who are endowed with not only rational and emotional capacities, but also free will. If God constantly intervenes in human affairs, in other words, if God micromanages our affairs, he deprives us of the consequences of free choices, of our free choices, and reduces us to mere robots. In other words, free will and responsibility go hand in hand. One cannot expect to enjoy the privileges of having free will and at the same time expect to be micromanaged by God. God is just. He is also wise. However, in talking about God's attributes and actions, one must not adopt an anthropomorphic approach. God's justice does not mean that God acts according to our understanding of justice. Our understanding of justice and our understanding of rationality, as well as our understanding of the principles of morality, are constantly evolving. Values such as justice and principles of ethics are objective and part of the fabric of reality. We constantly find out more and more about the infinite capacities of these values and principles and correct our earlier mistaken views about them through our lived experiences in the sphere of the human condition. I'll say more about the problem of evil in the subsequent part of my program. I must now say something about the issue of non-conventional lifestyles. I have deliberately chosen the term non-conventional lifestyles as an all-inclusive neutral term to cover all those groups who identify themselves to be outside the conventional part of a bell-shaped curve, which depicts the distribution of all types of sexual relationships between people. I discussed the issue of non-conventional lifestyles in a number of steps. First, this issue is a complicated one and therefore should be discussed with care and patience. There is no easy answer about it. Second, the complexity of issue is due to the impact of a number of independent factors, including God, the fuqaha, i.e. Muslim experts of Sharia law, the law of the land in different places, the individuals who have adopted the non-conventional lifestyles, and the varieties of these lifestyles, which each invites a separate treatment. Nowadays, the acronyms which identify these different lifestyles run to 9 different letters. For example, whereas the transvestites who wish to adjust their bodies to their psychological dispositions receive support from faith, Islamic jurisprudence, and the fuqaha, homosexuals are treated differently according to the traditional juristic rules. There are also certain differences between the religious rulings for homosexuals and lesbians. It is number 4. It is claimed by some scientists that non-conventional lifestyles have biological and genetic causes. This is, however, a controversial issue even among scientists themselves. Some scientists, for example, lay more emphasis on the environmental factors and minimize the role of biological causes. But assuming that at least some of those who prefer a non-conventional lifestyle are biologically programmed and cannot do anything about it, then this adds a new layer of difficulty to the problem of their status from a religious point of view. Number 5, as far as God is concerned, his will, as is understood by believers, is to facilitate mankind's journey towards the goal of getting as close to God and as similar to him as possible. In the context of Islam, whoever acknowledges himself or herself as a Muslim cannot be denied this status, i.e. being regarded as a Muslim. Among all attributes of God, the two that outshine the rest are his mercy and compassion. All Muslims, whether sinner or pious, could partake in the journey towards God. God does not deprive them, nor does he deprive even the non-believers of his mercy and compassion. Number 6, all Muslim fuqaha, jurists, have declared the homosexual and lesbian lifestyles as haram, forbidden, and prohibited Muslims from adopting them. 7, an individual who lives in a particular jurisdiction, Islamic or otherwise, is obliged to observe the law of the land in which she has chosen to reside. 8, if an observant Muslim who is inclined towards an unconventional lifestyle realized that her choice had been made as a result of the environmental pressures and not as the outcome of an unchangeable biological or genetic condition, then she ought to refrain from pursuing the lifestyle which is considered to be haram in the eyes of Sharia. Number 9, if an observant Muslim who is inclined towards a non-conventional lifestyle feels so due to her biological condition, then she is advised to adopt, if possible, a celibate lifestyle. This is in tune with the rulings of Sharia. Number 10, if an observant Muslim who is inclined towards a non-conventional lifestyle wishes to change her lifestyle and adopt a conventional lifestyle, then the authorities and lawmakers must provide her with all sorts of the facilities which are needed for this purpose. Number 11, if an observant Muslim who is inclined towards a non-conventional lifestyle decides not to adopt a celibate lifestyle, then she must be aware of the fact that in the eyes of Sharia, she is regarded as committing a heinous sin. Such an individual can still continue to be a participant and practicing Muslim. Her relation with God is only between him, her, and God. Sharia is mostly concerned with the Muslims' interactions in the public sphere. I now return to the last part of this section of my talk. I present one major difficulty for non-believers. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, introduced 3 fundamental questions, which in a sense set the agenda for the present debate. Kant's questions were as follows. What can I know? What must I do? What may I hope? The first question deals with our innate urge to acquire knowledge about reality. The second pertains to our conduct in life as moral agents. And the third concerns our fate at the end of our life. I readily grant that my learned friend, Professor Sheamur, could come up with more or less satisfactory answers for question 1 and 2. But I submit that finding a satisfactory answer to question 3 is not easy, if not impossible, for a non-believer. But why? The third question is closely related to what great thinkers of the 19th century, such as Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, had dubbed nihilism. It is about the meaning of one's life and the values one holds dear. It emerges because of the phenomenon of death and our awareness of its inevitability. The issue or challenge of nihilism can be formulated in the following way. If God does not exist, and if death means the absolute end to one's actual participation in life and the development of one's abilities and positive potentials, then the whole enterprise of living in the world as a self-conscious being with lofty ideas and ideals, including making the world a better place for all and lessening the amount of suffering, becomes meaningless or absurd. If one's perspective on life is based upon the conviction that one has come into a deaf and dumb universe by pure chance, and all that one can expect and hope for is, if one lucky, to live for a short period of time, and assuming that one is a moral agent, participate in a limited number of remarkable deeds before turning into a stardust. Then, if that is the case, one should ask oneself, what is the point? The above predicament has been brought into sharp relief by an eye-opening thought experiment suggested by Samuel Scheffler, the American philosopher. Scheffler invites us to think about the following scenario. I have made small changes to his thought experiment. Suppose scientists have discovered that a large asteroid is on course to hit the Earth a month from now. And as a result of the impact, the whole Earth will be annihilated and no one will survive. Scheffler asks how this affects one's attitude and the consideration about one's choices and what one has to do now. In the context of the above thought experiment, and with respect to Kant's third question, i.e., what may I hope, it seems non-believers can no longer hope that future generations will benefit from the fruits of their labor, and there will be nobody to either appreciate or benefit from them. In the context of the above thought experiment, it is not difficult to see that why nihilism poses a serious threat to those who think this life is all that they have got. The above, however, is not the case for believers who believe that this life is just a small part of a never-ending journey of acquiring perfection. I will explore the implications of the above scenario in the remaining parts of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Paya. Perfect timing. Okay. Now let us hear Professor Shermer's rejoinder for 10 minutes, please. You know, Professor Shermer, you have 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
you very much. And thanks very much to Professor Paya for what he had to say. I'd like to start by thanking him for his interesting response to my opening statement. As both of us have noted, issues with which we've been dealing have been widely debated over many, many years, and there are interesting parallels across the discussion in the three Abrahamic traditions. So each of us is just touching the surface of the issues with which we're dealing. And where, from a critical rationalist perspective, a proper evaluation would involve reconstructing how the debate has gone over time and joining in with that. But let me nonetheless offer a brief response to what he had to say. First of all, evil, pain, and God. Here, I'm afraid I don't agree with how Professor Paya has tackled the problem. I wrote as I did with an eye to work which, for example, has been undertaken by some able Christian apologists, such as C.S. Lewis. The issue which I highlighted takes for granted that there'll be some unfortunate things that happen simply as a consequence of how the world is structured and human freedom, and also God's not intervening to protect us from the consequences of particular actions. What I concentrated on seems to me to be an issue which apologists such as Lewis, and I thought also Professor Paya, really didn't engage with, namely the problem of what I referred to as design faults. I had in mind things that cause terrible pain and the destruction of the human personality, including, indeed, the capacities that humans have for worship and for religious participation. These things don't seem in any way to be the products of deliberate human action, and they also look as if in principle they're the kind of things that can be remedied if one had the relevant knowledge and capacities, without this giving rise to systematic problems for the structure of the world. I refer to two fairly obvious examples: Alzheimer's disease and many kinds of cancer, just on the grounds that they're the kind of things for which one can imagine humans in due course actually being able to design remedies to handle things which in effect were built-in faults to how things work without this upsetting the wider structure of the world. I say this just because there are other things which we've been able to do. For example, putting an end to smallpox, which don't appear to have other serious ramifications. My claim here is that if God is taken to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and benevolent, it's simply not clear how one can avoid the kinds of things that I highlighted as being counterexamples to his existence if these descriptions of him that I gave are correct. Next, homosexuality. I think that to address these issues in terms of non-conventional lifestyles, it just isn't adequate. The problem is constituted by people who find that they have exclusively same-sex attraction. We're dealing here with issues which, whether there are genetic or developmental reasons behind them, are experienced by particular individuals as simply given. There have been elaborate efforts, both psychological and religious, and ones which combine the two to effect cures, but these are simply reported on as having been unsuccessful. And they've been reported on by people who would have the strongest personal and religious motivations to hope that such cures would be effective. We are given what are taken to be religious revelations such that people should remain celibate, along with ideas about people needing to be put to death if they're not. Such ideas seem to be standard within all parts of the Abrahamic tradition as it was traditionally understood, but they seem to me to be terrible. That's to say, given that it's known to God for one reason or another, people will be like this, to condemn such people not just to celibacy, but not to be able to enjoy the kinds of relationships that mean so much for our development as people, with their combination of love, sexual fulfillment and friendship, it seems to me, again, terrible. What's needed is surely recognition of what people are actually like and the encouragement of the development of institutions and moral codes, which, given that, will enable them to live the best kinds of life that they can. And I think the arguments for gay marriage are significant here. What can we hope for? I would be inclined to say that this life is all that we have, and that if there is some notion of an afterlife, the picture of it which was held in classical Greece, and also, on my understanding, amongst the Jewish people before ideas about life after death came in, looks about right. That's to say, it would be that we end up in something like a celestial retirement home in which the process of physical and mental crumbling continues until there is nothing left of us. I personally, by contrast with this, can't make any ready sense of the idea of personal survival. We're people of our own times and specific backgrounds. Our personalities and concerns are very much tied to this. Personal relationships are obviously important to us, but they equally are tied to specific times and circumstances. The Roman Catholic writer Ronald Knox reported that Catholic theologians have speculated that in the afterlife, we would all be about 33 years old. Now, we might individually then be at our best, but hardly, I think, at our wisest. But how then could we relate to our parents, or if we have them, to our children, if everyone is the same age? That's to say, the character of the relationship that we have to our parents, or the character of the relationship, if we have it, to children, is surely tied in with our difference in age, our specific historical relationships to them. To talk about kind of free-floating people about 33 years old, I mean, it's not clear we'd have anything in common with our parents if we were all at that sort of age. Should the prospect of an extinction, for example, by a comet, have any implications in terms of our moral behavior? I would think not much. Clearly, there may be some utilitarian concerns which would no longer matter if we could be sure that the end of the world would end very soon. That's to say, we might, at the moment, be concerned to give money for famine relief, where we know, in fact, that it'll take some while for this to be effective. If we're told, well, it's 3 weeks and that's it, it wouldn't make sense to give that sort of assistance. But issues about respecting other people and other creatures and behaving with integrity would, in my view, matter to the end. Morality, it seems to me, is something that should be undertaken for its own sake. And I don't see that the impending end of my life or that of other people should make the slightest difference as to how we should behave. One final concluding note. Professor Paya reminded us of this Japanese gentleman who managed to climb Everest at a very advanced age. What I would say is that I suspect that he wasn't someone who spends most of his time sitting at a desk, typing into a computer, doing things on Zoom, or reading books. A realistic appraisal of my physical shape would suggest that a walk up to the top of a nearby hill might be pushing it a bit as a task for my 75th birthday. I think the hope of my getting to Everest under my own steam, as it were, is not a realistic one. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have to say I like that mountaineering anecdote that is being, discuss back and forth between the two debates. It's always good to use analogy because it would catch our attention. Okay, no, thank you very much, Professor Shermer. Let us hear Professor Paya's rejoinder for 10 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you so much. I should like again to thank my friend Professor Sheamur for his very interesting replies. I'm not going to directly reply to this part of his arguments. Instead, I'm going to present some further difficulties for critical, non-believer critical rationalists. Then, time permitting, I also briefly discuss two other issues which I have left out, i.e. the relationship between religion and our knowledge of world, and the issue of epistemic value of our mystical or religious experiences. I begin, however, by presenting some arguments which I hope will show that why the position of non-believers is less defensible vis-a-vis the position of believers. First, the argument from a network of related concepts. The network of the interconnected concepts of hope, suffering, death, consolation, and salvation could be used to produce some arguments against the position of non-believers. Hope, as we know, plays an important role in the well-being of individuals, groups, and nations. With respect to Kant's third question, i.e., what may I hope, the account that religion proposes could help people to adopt a more positive and hopeful attitude towards life, even in the face of adversities and unbearable sufferings. In my opening remarks, I briefly referred to the issue of emotional response to suffering and hardship, which are caused by tragedies such as the loss of our loved ones. Consoling people in such tragic situations is not easy. However, I would like to argue that even in such cases, believers have an edge over non-believers. Marcus Tullius Cicero, 106-43 BCE, the great Roman orator and politician and one of the best members of the school of Stoicism, who had written a treatise on consolation, is the champion of the art of consolation for non-believers even today. The Stoics, both classic and modern, maintain that wise individuals should learn to endure suffering. But as Michael Ignatieff has eloquently explained in his recent book on consolation, Facing Solace in Dark Times, when Cicero's beloved daughter died while giving birth to her child, Cicero's philosophical writings proved unable to console him. For a long time, the champion of consolation was unable to console himself. I should like to suggest as an empirically testable conjecture that believers are better equipped to deal with personal tragedies. For believers, even in the darkest hours, there is hope, since God never leaves his friends alone. It seems for the majority of people, the greatest personal tragedy is their own death or the death of their near and dear. Perhaps the most effective consolation in the case of death is the notion of salvation. I submit that such a powerful and positive tool is missing from the armory of non-believers. Luc Ferry, the French philosopher, himself a non-believer, in his book, A Brief History of Thought, A Philosophical Guide to Living, argues that one of the main reasons that Stoicism, despite all its powerful intellectual facilities, was defeated in competition with the then newly emerged Christianity was the poverty of its account of salvation. The Stoic doctrine of salvation is resolutely anonymous and impersonal. It promises us eternity, but of a non-personal kind, as an oblivious fragment of the cosmos. In contrast, Christianity and indeed all Abrahamic religions promise us no less than everything that we would wish for, i.e., personal immortality and salvation for our loved ones. My second argument is argument from the richness of religious life. Another point that gives believers an edge over non-believers is a particular type of richness which is exclusive to religious life. A non-religious individual who had never had any serious dealing with religious sphere, religious experiences, and religious forms of life cannot fully appreciate the literary and artistic works whose core meaning and values are religious. If God is removed from the history of mankind, this history will become very impoverished indeed. The majority of the greatest artistic and literary works in the history of mankind are inspired by the belief in God, i.e., a transcendental sublime reality. My third argument against non-believers is argument from justice and the life after death. Another argument which works in favor of the position held by believers is the issue of the unresolved cases of injustice at the level of individuals or groups. Throughout the history of mankind, there have been many cases in which individuals, groups, or even nations have been wronged by others without being able to obtain justice. If death is the end of everything, then innocent victims who have been wronged have every right to feel betrayed. Such victims, if they are convinced that they are not going to get the justice they deserve, may react in many unexpected ways which may not be compatible with the well-being of other innocent individuals or the society at large. In Islamic teachings, on the other hand, people are invited to observe justice in its fullest sense in all their activities. After all, they are created in the image of God and should try to become like Him. The Quran says, O believers, be you securers of justice, witnesses for God. Let not detestation for a people move you not to be equitable. Be equitable. That is nearer to taqwa, i.e., observing the etiquette of being in the presence of God. And observe taqwa of God. Surely God is aware of the thing you do. On the other hand, Islamic teachings assures the believers that God is aware of people's deeds and even their intentions, and He will reward them or punish them accordingly. An escape from His governance, i.e., His realm of authority, is impossible. Again, I quote the Quran. It says, and whoever does an atom's weight of good shall see it, and whoever does an atom's weight of evil shall see it. The above is a constant theme in the Quran. It is a message of hope for believers and a stern warning to wrongdoers. And let us not forget that one of God's attributes is truth, with capital T. This means, among other things, that God never gives any untrue message to people. Okay, now let me briefly tell you something about the relationship between religion and our knowledge of the God. When it comes to our knowledge of reality, it is clear from the teachings of Islam that the task of the Prophet and the Quran is not to teach us physics or chemistry. A clear division of labor can be observed in Islamic teachings. On the one hand, Islamic teachings encourage us to explore various aspects of reality by means of the power of intellect and the cognitive facilities made available to us. On the other, Islamic teachings help us to better understand the intricacies of the human condition, and even more importantly, the complexities of the afterlife. Our understanding of the teachings of Islam, as critical rationalists explain, always remain conjectural. And of course, we are expected to constantly subject our conjectures to the severest critical assessment. Okay, now let me say something briefly about epistemic force of religious or mystical experiences. Mystical experiences are a subset of the lived religious experiences. And lived religious experiences are in turn a subspecies of the lived or personal experiences in general. Lived experiences in general, as critical rationalists have argued, form the backbone of all knowledge claims. In the absence of such experiences, which are informed by our quest to find solutions for some challenges reality presents to us, no conjecture can be formed. And in the absence of conjectures about reality, no knowledge can be gained. To be of epistemic service to us, our personal or lived experiences should be reconstructed with the help of our memory, the conceptual schemes available to us, and the language facilities at our disposal. Personal experiences which are reconstructed take the shape of statements and propositions. In this form, they can be presented as conjectures or knowledge claims concerning certain aspects of reality to the public sphere for critical scrutiny. Whether a particular personal or lived experience is refuted or corroborated as a result of critical scrutiny in the public sphere, we stand to learn something about reality. In the case of refutation, we learn that reality is not the way a refuted conjecture had claimed. In the case of corroboration, we regard the knowledge imparted by the conjecture in question as our best understanding for the time being of a particular aspect of reality. Muslim mystics, Urafa, have introduced rigorous methods for separating fake mystical experiences from the genuine ones. They have discussed the method in various books. One of the better known works in this genre is an Arabic treatise, a treatise on what cannot be trusted or relied on. This treatise contains more than 300 practical instructions to help the practitioners of mysticism and the public to assess the worth of the mystical experiences. So, in a sense, both mystical and religious experiences could be used in order to assist us to further our knowledge about reality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Paya. Now we have heard the opening statements as well as the rejoinders of both sides of the debate. Now it's time for intra-panel discussions. As I explained in the introduction, the debaters can interfere during the other side's talk and even interrupt each other, but the flow of the discussion should be maintained. But before opening the floor for 20 minutes intra-panel discussion, allow me to make a humble suggestion for a point to be made clear in the intra-panel discussion. Since both debaters think that other side is reasonable in principle in his religious or non-religious position, i.e. Professor Shermer thinks that Professor Paya is in principle reasonable in his religious position, and Professor Paya thinks that Professor Shermer is in principle reasonable in his non-religious position. And the edge of the debate or the focus of the debate is that which side is more reasonable. So maybe as a humble suggestion, we need to hear more about why each side thinks that the other side could be in principle reasonable, i.e. Professor Shermer, it would be good if you explain for us why you think that a religious person could be in principle reasonable. And Professor Paya, it would be good if we hear from you, why do you think that a non-religious person could be in principle reasonable? Otherwise, the discussion would end up becoming like a discussion between two sides, that each side taking the other side to be non-reasonable, which is a typical kind of discussion between religious and non-religious discussion. So probably we need to hear more to make a clear distinction between your position, which is about more reasonability or less reasonability, and other typical conduct discussion between religious and non-religious persons. So the floor is open for 20 minutes intra-panel discussion, please.
Okay, I think my colleague, Professor Shermer, should go ahead because he began the discussion. So I am all ears listening to your incisive criticisms.
Okay, could I start by addressing the issue that was thrown at us by our chair and then move to some issues which I'd like to raise in connection with your own remarks, Professor Paya. I suggest taking those in 3 bits, just on the grounds that turning it into a big speech would cut across what we're after. I think that the reason why I was able to argue that Professor Paya is reasonable and that it's perfectly reasonable for him to be a religious believer is because, as I would understand it, he is someone who will hold his beliefs as being open to question and contestation, and also is in a certain sense committed as a believer, but also someone who's a professional intellectual, to grappling where they are in his realm of competence with problems that may be put forward seriously about his views. I think that by contrast, what one finds quite often is people undertaking debating style discussions in the bad sense, thinking that they can resolve difficult issues by knockdown points, by brandishing particular texts, by in a certain sense not paying any attention to, on the one side, what the conversation has been on the topics with which we're concerned, but on the other, not bearing in mind what the history of some of our best kind of knowledge has been, what we get in some of the natural sciences, where even the best of our theories have turned out to be flawed, and all kinds of expectations that people had about the framework within which things should be addressed have been argued to be problematic. But why then do I say that I don't think that Professor Paya's views are reasonable? Well, it's really because, as I just started to argue, and these are matters on which we could talk for a very long time, it seems to me that the sheer accumulation of problems which face the religious believer are just so daunting that I simply can't see how it's reasonable for someone of his undoubted capacities to think that he can actually deal with them. Now, a stronger example of this I alluded to in my presentation, where I talked about people who favored the theory of so-called intelligent design. And this typically consists of people raising problems about Darwinism and saying, well, what we need to do is to take an approach to biology and to the phenomenon of nature that Darwinian-style theories have adopted, but to take instead what is in effect a creationist approach to it. And my view there is, well, they can certainly wish to do that, but what one would need to discover is, as it were, how in principle they think that they're going to develop alternative ideas in the areas where Darwinian approaches have been successful. And it seems to me that the problem for the religious believer is really to face up, first of all, to the full agenda of what the problems and difficulties are, and then really to have a stab at indicating how they're going to overcome them. And it's not clear to me from our exchange that Professor Paya really got on top of even the rather modest examples that I had the time to present in our discussion. Professor Paya may disagree.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, I disagree. Although I must admit that many of the points which you shared with us are serious problems. And as I mentioned in my presentations, I am not at all underestimating the weight, and I freely acknowledge that one should take them seriously. But what I would want to tell you and others who are listening and watching is that at least some Muslims, because as you remember, I mentioned quite explicitly that my approach to religion differs from many other different approaches. So it is not the case that being a religious individual is just like unified pattern applies to all. There are many different types of understanding of religious teachings. Actually, to the number of religious people, you can find interpretations. So it is important to keep in mind that my approach to religion is from within the framework of critical rationalism. And as you know better than me, critical rationalism imposes a certain number of restrictions upon our claims. For example, you mentioned about the defects in the intelligent design approaches. Okay, intelligent design is a program which is being pursued by a number of religious people, but let me explain to you my own position with respect to that program. As I mentioned in my presentation, a critical rationalist who is a religious individual maintains that God is wise and he has created a world which is full of mystery, full of patterns, full of signs of intelligence. It is not, as you were saying, suffering from design fault. I guess one of the objections or criticisms I would want to level at your arguments is the following. It seems to me, and you refer to C.S. Lewis, it seems to me, I may be mistaken, please correct me if I'm mistaken, but it seems to me that you are not appreciating the depth of the argument which is being presented by religious people. People would say that whatever structure you create, forget about God, think about yourself. Whatever the structure you create, as soon as you set the general design, a number of restrictions would impose themselves upon you, regardless of how do you like to change them. No, these are inherent consequences of those initial conditions. As soon as you adopted them, those consequences would follow. Let me give you just a very simple example. Think about a simple game of chess. You set a number of rules, you assign movements to different chief chessmen, and you start playing. Now, suppose someone says that, no, I want to move my knight in this way, or my bishop in that way. This is impossible. The bishop role in that structure is being restricted. So those restrictions are being imposed upon whoever creates some sort of a structure. Now, in many cases, what you call default design fault or shortcomings are really, if you look at them clearly, are not shortcomings at all. They are restrictions which are being imposed upon us because of the natural consequences of the initial conditions.
Could I interrupt just
please,
at that point? Because I tried, and I clearly didn't put it clearly enough, to say, yes, indeed, it's the case that there will be some things which are simply consequences of the way in which things are. There will be other things which are consequences of human freedom of action and a decision, as it's understood on the part of God, not to sort of protect us from particular ones of these. My entire argument was set up within the structures which we have, but to say that there are problems which arise within that, which can, in fact, in some cases, and potentially in other cases, be remedied without upsetting the necessary consequences of the structures that exist. So I mean, you're basically repeating to me things that I have already explicitly said that I admit. You may simply deny that anything exists in the area that I'm talking about, but that would be an empirical argument. It seems to me that the activities of doctors looking at structural issues, say concerning the human body, to remedy problems are directed at exactly the kind of things that I'm talking about.
Yeah, okay. Let me take one of your examples. You mentioned the case of Alzheimer and cancer, okay? Now, the point which I'm trying to explain is the following. Causes of cancer are exactly being put in place when the whole universe began to unfold, right from the moment of Big Bang. Now, if you are saying that, okay, God should have done something about the initial conditions at the moment of Big Bang and should have created another type of universe, I would tell you that, fine, think about any other universe. In any other possible universe, you would have raised exactly the same problem about cases which would emerge there in those universes. Because in any type of structure which is being confined or defined by a number of initial conditions, limitations would arise. And some limitations may be detrimental to us. Fine.
But you're still missing my point here, okay, which is that, take, for example, I mean, there are things which human action has been able to remedy, such as smallpox. Okay. Now, if that was possible for human doctors within the structure of the world as it exists, then, and where it would certainly look as if this doesn't create problems of its own, or rather, I mean, if you think that things that doctors do to intervene in this way do create problems, this is a recipe for quietism in the face of dreadful diseases, but where the kinds of concerns that people have had in the pursuit of what's responsible for Alzheimer's disease and how that could be addressed are ones which so far have not been particularly successful, but where it would seem to me perfectly possible to imagine that in, say, 20 years' time, these have been remedied, and that what may need to be remedied in this case can, I think, be fairly said to be a design fault, because it doesn't upset the fundamental structure of things, but it deals with these particular problems.
Again, with all due respect to you, I guess we are not being able to, if you like, converge over, in my view, something which seems to me pretty clear. Okay, let me try again and see whether I could do better this time. You mentioned the smallpox, or you can mention any other disease. Okay, our universe or any other possible universe has many, many different possible pathways which could be actualized according to the way things may develop or unfold. Part of the pattern of actualization of what is possible in a universe, think about our own universe, is related to our intervention. Okay, our intervention may actualize one particular pathway which in other scenarios may have not been actualized. So the emergence of different diseases could have not been prevented right from the start, because if God had decided to do that, he should have made no move whatsoever. What I'm saying is that in whatever structure you put in place, you design, again, go back to a game of chess, there are many, many, many different types of moves which can be actualized in a game of chess, okay? But in any particular game, only a limited number of those, perhaps infinitely many possible moves are actualized. What I'm saying is that in our case, the fact that we have been exposed to a smallpox has not been because of a fault in the design. It has been because of the fact that we have decided to move on a particular course of activities, and that course of activities have actualized or have activated that particular pathway. So, and that is the case in any possible scenario which you may think of. It is impossible. Let me just finish this. It is impossible for any designer, to create something, if the assumption is this: you want to create an infinitely rich structure. You do not want to confine those who are living in this structure to very limited type of movements. It is an infinitely rich structure. This means that there are many possibilities, and those possibilities could be actualized if you activate this pathway or that pathway. In whatever pathway you care to activate the movement of things, there may emerge something which may be detrimental to us. That is inevitable.
Look, we're clearly not going to agree on this, but it seems to me that the closing off of the occurrence of certain diseases isn't something which on the face of it, by us, is not something that seems to be restrictive in the kind of way that you're invoking. And if it's possible for us, on the basis of your views, it should also have been possible for God. But on this one, I don't think we're going to get far. Could I turn to the topic of God as a consolation?
Yeah, we have less than 1 minute, please.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Okay, I make two comments here. God would only be a consolation if one could make a plausible case for his existing, and I think that the problems that I raised were posed a difficulty here. And the second thing is that it seems to me that if one takes the issues that I've raised about God and the occurrence of Alzheimer's and the way in which homosexuals are treated, then I'd see the existence of God not as a consolation, but something really which is very worrying.
Okay, do I have time to respond?
Yeah, I don't want to break this exciting discussion. Very, very shortly, please. Yeah.
Okay, you want me to pour the whole ocean into a small Okay, which is impossible. So going back to consolation, what you need to think about, Professor Sheamur, is that in the eyes of believers, God is an all-loving creator who takes care of the whole realm of creation. So even if something may appear to be a case of suffering or hardship, true believers, because of their constant dealing with God, God is being regarded as a friend, as a close friend in the religious literature. He earns that position because of his constant companionship with those who care to pay attention to him. And this is something which I'm not exaggerating at all. We can ask this from any religious individual. In such a situation, if someone is your close friend and close companion, you would put your trust in him. And even if you suffer from something which you may think has come from him, because of your trust in him, you would understand that you may have been mistaken, and at the end, it will be clear that he had your best intention at heart. Okay, I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much for intra-panel discussions. Now, let us hear the closing statement of Professor Shermer for 5 minutes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think our discussion could have gone on for a very long while. I've already indicated that I don't actually think that Professor Paya has really managed to get to grips with the problems that I've raised before, but I'd like to conclude by a few practical responses to his criticisms. While I have been critical, I think that I have great respect for observant religious people in the Abrahamic traditions and their moral behavior, their devotion to observance, including charity, and the disciplined moral life that they have seems to me admirable. And I say this despite the fact that I have reservations about aspects of what's required as religious practice. I also have great respect for these people's maintenance of the decencies of conservative moral practices in the face of the challenges of the modern world. And I'd be happy to live among them, and indeed be happy to count them as my friends if they would have me. I think, though, that Professor Paya's arguments about the richness of religious life are a bit off. I fully agree with him that some of the greatest works of art and literature have been religious in their inspiration. Personally, while I'm not a Christian, I think that Verdi's Requiem is absolutely magnificent. And if I was stuck on a desert island, as they asked people to imagine in a BBC radio program, I would certainly take a recording of that along. His Requiem is his dramatic, orchestral, and choral treatment of the Catholic Mass for the dead. To appreciate properly such work, it requires, amongst other things, that one understands the theology involved in it. However, I can well believe that for a devout Catholic, Verdi's Requiem might have an aesthetic power that it could never have for me as a non-believer. But we can, after all, come to some understanding of what is involved if one learns about other traditions, and particularly if one does so under the guidance of those who are involved in those traditions. Muslims, if their understanding of Islam allowed them to learn about or listen to Verdi's Requiem, would, I believe, also find it superb. Clearly, these aesthetic benefits are extras that someone who's a believer for other reasons may get to enjoy. I think we should all be taught what different religious views amount to, not least so that we can appreciate these cultural objects. Theology seems to me really important, and those who I believe totally incorrectly misrepresent religion as being just about moral teachings seem to me, in addition to being factually wrong, also to risk diminishing our understanding and appreciation of important religious works. Morality seems to me to be something that should be practiced for its own sake. Indeed, any notion of reward or even of praise seems to me inappropriate other than for children as part of their moral education. We do, however, need ongoing discussion about what good conduct amounts to in changing social conditions and about issues concerning what else should be expected of everyone and about supererogation, about what we should perhaps be doing beyond what is morally necessary, but also the proper limits of this. But I don't see that life after death, or indeed God, has anything to contribute here. Although clearly there may be some people who refrain from terrible conduct because of religious generated fears. Personally, I prefer that they believe what's true, even if the rest of us have to suffer as a consequence. As to punishment, I'd see three elements as involved. First, it being something involved in a process of education concerning how we should behave towards one another. This can involve a public affirmation of what acceptable conduct would be and the imposition of something like a penance, a public penance for non-compliance. Second is that we need to do our best to try to avoid people profiting from doing wrong, perhaps by fining them or by making work to improve our institutions. And third, we may need to protect ourselves and others from predators, including those who have no instinctive moral concerns. This, it seems to me, could in some cases involve imprisonment or indeed the imposition of a death penalty. From my perspective, it seems to me important that we discuss and affirm and entrench institutionally what behaving well amounts to. But I'm dubious about punishment other than in the context that I've indicated. I think, say, that if people have done terrible things in their youth, then there's no point in punishment beyond a kind of token penance once they've become elderly, for they're in most respects a different person for what they were like when they committed the offense. Once they're dead, any notion of punishment seems to me pointless, although it would seem to me important, if they seem to have got away with terrible behavior, to explain to other people what they did and just why it was so bad and should be avoided. This, all told, is my response to the issues that we've been dealing with, and I look forward to hearing Professor Paya's summing up of his approach.
Thank you very much, Professor Shermer. Okay, now we have reached the closing statement of Professor Paya. But before that, Professor Paya, can I ask you a question just to make sure that I got your answer to my question quite right? You think that a non-religious position could be in principle reasonable as far as non-religious person are willing to subject their position to criticism, but all in all, you think at the end the religious position is better capable of addressing existential and intellectual problems. That's why you think it's more reasonable to be religious, correct?
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, what you just suggested or mentioned is at the core of what I'm trying to convey to my dear friend, Professor Sheamur. As I mentioned in my presentation, different parts of my presentation, a world which is devoid of God is a very impoverished world. So what I'm arguing for is that although a non-believer rational individual could be moral, but he or she will use a great deal with respect to values and meanings which are embedded in our universe. A universe which is created by an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God. Okay, let me go to my brief concluding remarks. Now that both Professor Sheamur and I have presented a summary of our arguments, in the last part of my talk, I would like to highlight some of the main arguments which I hope show why a critical rationalist is better off being a believer and not a non-believer. I mentioned some cases, but briefly, let me say something about Professor Shermer's point concerning verdis requiem and the ability of non-believers to appreciate religious art. I never denied that non-religious people are not capable of appreciating aspects of religious art. What I suggest, and I disagree with Professor Sheamur, who says that religious people may be able to appreciate some aesthetic aspect of religious life better. No, it is not just an aesthetic aspect. Religious art and religious literature have inspirational and revelationary aspects which are not available to non-believers. These are available to believers because those arts would open up areas of reality which would be close to those who do not share that form of life and those set of beliefs. Okay, I go through my notes. As we discussed earlier, it seems to me that the issue of the end of life and unresolved cases of injustice and inequity cannot be adequately answered by those who do not believe in an all-knowing, all-powerful, absolutely just and merciful God. Allow me to elaborate. The points which Professor Sheamur has mentioned in his concluding remarks mostly are related to the case of individuals, but there are cases in which groups or even nations are being run and no justice has been given to them. Critical rationalists lay great emphasis on living a moral life and the duty of individuals to do their best to make the world a better place for all. But how this goal can be achieved in practice? For critical rationalists, why in the realm of ideas, one is to be revolutionary in that one should try to produce as many viable conjectures for theoretical problems and critically assess their weaknesses in the hope of learning from their shortcomings. When it comes to dealing with people, it urges caution and suggests adopting a piecemeal approach towards making the world a better place for all. Now, consider the case of those who believe that death is the end of everything for them. If they have been wronged and have suffered from cases of unresolved injustice, they are likely to adopt one of the following two approaches. They may become depressed and live the rest of their lives with the sad and depressing feeling that others had wronged them without any prospect of receiving justice. Or they may decide to take the law into their own hands and rebel against the system they regard as unjust. Neither of these options leaves much room for making the world a better place, because in the first case, the individuals will be victim of others, of what others have done to them, and in the second, the action of the rebel individuals can cause death and destruction of lives and properties and victimization of innocent individuals. In contrast, as was explained before, a critical rationalist approach to religion encourages people to do their best to live a moral life and help make the world a better place for all. But at the same time, it tells the individual not to lose hope under any circumstances and never yield to despair and depression. It advises the individuals that even if they could not reap the rewards of their labor in this world, and even if, as a result of the injustices inflicted upon them, and they have not been able to obtain justice despite their best rational efforts to address them, at the end of the day, all is not lost, and they can remain hopeful that their good deeds are not wasted and the inequities they have received undeservedly at the hand of the others will not go unpunished. So this means that they ought to remain moral. This is because, according to the view to which a religious clinical rationalist subscribes, this work is only the first stage of a never-ending journey towards perfection, and whatever people do, good or bad, will be assessed by an omniscient, omnipotent, just, and compassionate God. In contrast, a deaf and dumb world, which is subject to blind, random actions of physical forces, is a very scary and terrifying taboo indeed. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. On behalf of the Islamic Cultural Center of Northern California, actually, I would like to thank both Professor Shermer and Professor Paya for their contribution to this debate, and I also would like to thank the people in the audience, wherever you are. And I also wanted to say that please accept our apologies for the confusion and the delay to start the event. Inshallah, it will not happen again. If you're interested in this debate, please stay tuned. Each semester, we will have one such debate. It's always free and no registration is needed. So let me conclude this debate with a famous dua, petitionary prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr, 1892 to 1917, an American Reformed theologian and moral philosopher. This dua is called the Serenity Prayer, and it's very famous. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Hope to see you all soon. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.